Hello? Can everybody hear me? Hello? It's 3 o'clock. We're going to get started. I'm Kathy Becker. I'm from the Middlesex Conservation District, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here to this workshop today. I'd also like to thank our panel of speakers. We have some great speakers today, and I'd especially like to thank Katie Caruth because she did a lot of work identifying many of the needs in our county, and this workshop is an outgrowth of the work that she's been doing. That was sponsored by a grant from the Conservation District Innovation Grant from the Mass Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. I dare you to say that twice. Conservation districts are over 70 years old, and they've been working with what used to be called the Soil Conservation Service. It's now called NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Services. And conservation districts are our way, local people, it's our way to tell the federal government what the priorities in our county are that have to do with soil and water. Anyway, it's time to get things rolling. The other people to thank are Audubon for co-sponsoring this with us. And here we go. Have a great workshop.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. So my name's Heidi Ritchie. I work for Mass Audubon, and I'm also on the board of the Citizen Planner Training Collaborative, which is co-sponsoring this as well with the Middlesex Conservation District. And I want to thank you all for coming out. It's really great to see such a great crowd here on this topic this afternoon. So again, just to acknowledge all the organizations that were involved in putting this together. The Middlesex Conservation District took the lead with Katie, came to CPTC, the Citizen Planner Training Collaborative, and asked if they would partner with the district in putting together a workshop on open space and agricultural lands. And so Mass Audubon is one of the member organizations of that collaborative through our Shaping the Future of Your Community program. And I agreed to take on the role of coordinating with Katie and putting this together. Just a quick overview on the agenda for the workshop today. So I'm going to speak just briefly for a few minutes and give a little bit of background information. And then Jennifer Hashley from the New Entry Sustainable Farming organization is going to give some information about the status and trends of agriculture and farmlands in the area. And then we're going to have a presentation from Kathy Sfera, who's a conservation planner in Stowe and very experienced in land use planning all across the state. And she's going to give a more in-depth presentation on land conservation and how municipalities can go about that successfully. And then we have a really dynamic panel of speakers at the end. What we did here is we brought together a diverse group of different municipal officials and staff to provide different perspectives on this topic. And I hope that that will lead to some lively question and answer and discussion. So just quickly for background, how many of you are familiar with Mass Audubon's Losing Ground reports? Great, I see quite a few hands coming up. So every 5 years, Mass Audubon does an analysis of land use trends across the state and of conservation. And the last edition was produced in 2014. We're going to be producing another edition this year, later this year, so stay tuned. And what we found is sort of a continuing trend of what we call the sprawl frontier. So the area around the 495 belt and going out a bit westward and southward, where there's a lot still of large lot, single-family home development that eats up land much more quickly than the population is actually growing. So there are many values and functions that the natural landscape and farmlands provide for us, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through each of these, but you can all read them, and you can probably think of other reasons why you value open space in your community. Quickly, a few of the key findings from the last edition of Losing Ground. In terms of statewide trends, we found that there was about 13 acres of land per day being developed on average during the time frame of that study, which was 2005 through 2013. And during that same period of time, there was about 41 acres of land per day preserved. So this was actually a very encouraging trend, and almost 3 times as much land, about 3 times as much land being protected as developed. But it's important to note that this took place during the depths of the Great Recession, when development was really at its lowest ebb. And also that the rate of conservation had really ramped up, and so it's going to be interesting to see in the next report how those trend lines have changed. In terms of looking ahead, we found that at that time, a little bit more than half of the state, the land in the state, it was neither protected nor developed. So that offers a real opportunity for meeting all of our needs. And then within that land, about 54% of it is of high conservation value. So it's biomap 2 lands that have been mapped by Mass Wildlife. So, we have opportunities for both to meet the development needs that we have and to do targeted conservation. I zoomed in just a little bit more and looked at the data from Middlesex County, since it's the Middlesex Conservation District sponsoring this workshop. And trends were, some similar, some a little different. About 3,300 acres developed and 8,800 protected, so that trend kind of mirrors the statewide trend overall in terms of percentages. As you might expect, because this is metropolitan Boston region, the overall total amounts of land that have been developed and protected since the beginning of time are a little bit different. So statewide, about a quarter of the land is protected. Here in Middlesex County, only about 19%. Statewide, about 22% of the land is developed. Here, it's more like 37%. But this still leaves 44% of the land in Middlesex County neither developed nor protected. So again, we still have a lot of opportunities. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on housing. There are others on the panel, I believe, here, and probably others of you in the room who know more about housing than I do. But I do know that we have a real housing crisis in this state, and a very strong need, not just for affordable housing, but for mid-range housing for the workforce. And these are just some statistics I pulled from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and the Mass Housing Partnership. So they're projecting that in the metropolitan Boston area, we need almost 500,000 new housing units over the next couple of decades. And we already have a shortage of almost 40,000 housing units in this area. So, and the trend lines are not good in terms of the rate at which we're developing new housing is not keeping up with the growing demand. So thinking about all that, what might the future bring? And how can we guide it in a direction that might be most beneficial to our communities? Harvard Forest has done this tremendous new online New England Land Use Futures Explorer, and it has all sorts of maps and data available in it, which I encourage you to explore at some time, or come to one of the big environmental conferences this spring, MACC, CPTC, or the Land Conference. There are going to be workshops with more information about this at all of those. But they've projected potential scenarios, 4 different scenarios for land use out to the year 2060. And I'm just showing here 2 of them that contrast the most. On the left, there's a connected communities scenario where communities really dig in and plan carefully and update their land use regulations and do targeted conservation in a very thoughtful way. And on the right is a more sort of willy-nilly growing global approach where development and growth just happens sort of without any controls, opportunistically, and with a great increase. And so just showing how the sprawl frontier might spread under that scenario. So which future do we want? Is there a third future that we all want, and how do we get there? So I hope that gives you some food for thought to start off with, and now I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Hashley from New Entry Farming. Yeah, I can. Great.
Thank you. Oh, no worries. Thank you. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for that nice introduction and kind of laying the groundwork for where we are. I'm going to talk a little bit about ag and the fact that there are farmers who actually want to farm, so that's hopeful, I hope. So I just wanted to start out with a little glib introduction. You know, we do all eat. Sometimes I think we forget that. And we eat food of some sort or another, and that comes from farms, I hope, and it's grown by farmers, ranchers, fishermen. There are a lot of people involved in a pretty complex food system. And so sometimes I think it's so easy to get lost in the fact that you can walk into a supermarket and buy anything off the shelf at any point in time that we forget where that comes from, how it gets there, how people are treated along the way, how land is used, the ecological impact, you know, the corporate control and consolidation, the lack of diversity in our diet, things like that are kind of beyond our control. And so I just wanted to point that out and kind of bring that to perspective. So in thinking about who is doing this work, you know, we can talk all day about preserving farmland and keeping open space in our communities, but it really depends on the people that have the skills and knowledge to do that and the economic viability to make sure that they're paid fairly and can keep the business going sustainably and take care of the land and the workers and all the other pieces of that. So we've seen in the United States over time, over the past many decades, the decline in agriculture and the decline in the number of farmers and the increasing consolidation of acreage in agriculture. And so this is just another trend line of sort of how things have been moving along. Farms are getting bigger, you know, land staying somewhat flat, but acres per farm going up and the number of farms going down. So that's just a bigger representation of increasing aggregation. When a farm, you know, decides to go out of business or they don't have an identified successor, generally what's happening are people are buying up the farms or they're being converted to other uses. So you can see some of that. And then in Massachusetts, this is just a quick snapshot of what's happening here and where, you know, kind of our own agriculture production. I'm sorry, it's a little bit small and hard to read, but, you know, the average farm size in Massachusetts is about 67 acres of land. And you know, there's a lot going on in Middlesex and Worcester County. We have over 7,700 farms in Massachusetts. There are about working over 500,000 acres, and we produce almost $500 million in ag products. So the average farm produces about $63,000 of ag products on these 67 acres on average, and that we contribute about 28,000 jobs in Massachusetts. So even what's another interesting data point is that while in the US there was a decline in agriculture from the last census, 2007 to 2012, and we're still waiting for the 2017 census data to come out, it's done about every 5 years, we were one of the few states that actually showed a 1% increase in growth in agriculture, which I thought was interesting. We increased our number of farms and acres and farmland by about 1%. We rank about 5th in sales of direct markets, and third in the nation for direct markets sales per operation. And that accounts for about 10% of the state's total sales in agriculture. And this is really exciting because it is an opportunity for our farmers to connect directly with our consumers. So we're not the kind of state where we're shipping things off to be further processed. A lot of the food that we grow is going directly to people who are eating it, which is really exciting. Agritourism is really growing as well. In the census periods, we've seen a 141% increase in agritourism. So that's a way that communities and people are engaging on the farm and interacting with farmland in a different way. It's also adding to the bottom line of farmers and making it more economically viable, which is exciting. And you can see the data I pulled out, Worcester County and Middlesex County there, so you can see. But one of the other interesting things is we rank pretty highly in terms of that kind of activity in all U.S. counties. So for direct market sales, Worcester County is 6th in the nation, and Middlesex County is 10th in the nation. For not being a big traditional ag state, we're doing a lot of direct marketing. And same thing for agritourism. We're 5th in Worcester and 16th in Middlesex. CSAs, community-supported agriculture, is another form of sort of risk sharing and cost sharing between consumers and farms. We have a lot of them in Massachusetts. And Middlesex is the first county in the country with the largest number of CSA farms per population size. So that was pretty exciting to see that as we move forward. So I can say that, demand for local food is growing. There's a lot of interest. The latest data that the Economic Research Service showed that, local food sales, the first time they started tracking that back in 2008 was a little bit over $5 billion, and in 2014, the last time they've done an updated study, and we're waiting for the census data to come out again, was almost $12 billion in sales. So people actually really want local food, which is great. But even though we do a lot in Massachusetts, New England-wide as a region, we're not very food self-sufficient. So there's a study that a group of universities have done, Tufts and Penn State and others, really were looking at the Northeast, not just New England, but they expanded it as a whole, and then they did a little data set about New England, what we produce here versus what we consume. So we produce about half our dairy, a little less than about 37% of our vegetables, although most of that is potatoes from Maine. So that skews the vegetable data a little bit. We produce less than 10% of the fruit that we consume, and almost negligible, 1% or less, of grains and pulses or legumes and animal protein. So we're not very food self-sufficient. If we were cut off from the rest of the food system in this country, that's about what we have in operation. And to go along with what we were talking about earlier with the Harvard Forest Vision, they've also, similar groups of folks came together and put together a New England Food Vision. I'm sure many of you have probably been to presentations hearing about that 50 by 60 vision, where folks are kind of imagining what it would look like if we could produce 50% of our food by 2060, and what kind of land use changes that would need to be. Are there any dietary changes? What would that system look like? And then the other big information out there is that we do have farmers, but they're getting older, as you can imagine. The average age of farmers in the area is almost 60 years old and getting over. It'll be interesting to see again the 2017 census data if that keeps creeping up. And Land for Good and American Farmland Trust did a deep dive into that census data, really looking at the aging farmers. And do they have identified successors? Do they have people that are going to take over their farms and keep this land in production? And unfortunately, this is kind of where those things fell. Most of the farmers don't. Almost 90% of the farmers over the age of 65 don't have anyone under the age of 45 working with them or know who's going to take over their farm. So we need a lot of new farmers just to replace the farmers that are getting older. And this is a little bit more of a deep dive. You can kind of see the breakout here of Massachusetts in particular, their ages and how much land they control. So that's kind of a scary statistic in and of itself. When that land changes hands, if somebody isn't there to continue the operation, what do they do with it? And it's a shame to have a lot of land that's been worked over many years sitting idle waiting for the next person to step into place. Then there's the whole other 800-pound gorilla of climate change and how that's going to be impacting how we grow our food, both globally but also locally. This was a picture of one of our incubator farm training sites in Dracut. We're seeing a lot more weather events that are either causing drought or heavy floods and rain. The last couple of growing seasons in the spring have been really challenging getting started because we've had a lot of really wet, cold weather. And you can see from the weather we've had this winter, we just don't know what to expect anymore. So farmers are also really being asked not only to try to be economically viable in a growing globalized food system, but how do they deal with this, increasing level of risk with climate variability and things that they can't control. So this has a big impact on attracting a future workforce to farming. So how do we tell this story in a way that still leaves hope that people will actually want to continue to farm and take care of the land and steward it into the future? And that's something that I wake up and worry about every day because it's a big serious issue. And there are people that want to farm. So I'm here to tell you today that there are people who do want to do this, who are excited to steward the land and feed their communities and build these opportunities for food security in our region. And they are anyone and everyone from young people to immigrants and refugees who come with ag backgrounds, career changers who are tired of the corporate grind, retirees who are waiting for the next phase in their life and want to grow food, and unemployed folks looking for an opportunity, veterans who have really amazing skill set to contribute to agriculture. But they need a lot of support. They need business savvy. They've got to be able to navigate this complex food system and figure out how to make money. They need adequate markets. They need the skills to do it. They need land. So we're here to talk about land. They also need housing. They need to live near where they're going to farm. They need to be able to afford to get a home where they can go out and check on their animals in the middle of the night, or if there's a greenhouse emergency and the heat goes out, they need to be able to get to their farm. They need to be able to afford to live in the community where they farm, where land is conserved. And that's a huge issue, and I can speak to that from personal experience, and I know there are probably folks in the room who've also had that challenge. It's not enough just to save the land, but also to make sure that the farmers can also live there. And then the capital, the skills, and one of the most important pieces, I think, for any farmer to feel successful is having a broad community of support. And that's consumers, policymakers, others, to make sure that they're really trying to help agriculture remain viable. And then ongoing technical support. So that's what my organization, the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, that's what we're working on. We're really trying to make sure that there is a pipeline of future farmers, that they're well-trained, have the resources that they need, and that we're advocating and encouraging farmland to be preserved so that they have a place to go, and that there's markets and all the other good stuff I mentioned. So I won't go through our mission and vision. I did want to ask all of you a question. So I love this cartoon, The Real Reason Farmers Get Up Early, because they have to do so many things every day. But it's also kind of thinking about decisions in your life. So if you think back to when you were 5 years old, what did you want to be when you grew up? Anyone? A fireman? All right, what else? A mailman? What was that? An equestrian, all right. An astronaut, all right. I love that example. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jorge's story. Imagine you wanted to be an astronaut, and you weren't sure what you needed to do to become an astronaut, or a fireman, or a mailman, or whatever. And guesses are whoever's put their hands up, they didn't become that, and something got in their way. And so sometimes if you have a dream to fulfill what you want to do in life, it's not always clear what the path is to get there. And so Jorge is a perfect example. He had a dream that he wanted to come to the United States and farm. He's from Mexico, and he'd been growing, was a farm worker on a very large-scale broccoli farm, conventional broccoli farm. So his job was to spray lots of chemicals and harvest broccoli, and it was all shipped to the United States. And due to a lot of other political reasons, he came to the United States legally and wanted to start a farm, but wasn't sure how to do that here. Didn't know a lot about organic agriculture, didn't know how to get land. So what New Entry did for him, and for anyone else like Jorge, who's not sure when they decide they want to be a farmer, how to go about achieving their dream, we really try to help people think through the entire process of that, whether it's deciding, is this really right for me? Do I want to do this commercially? Helping them develop a business plan, helping them get access to land, helping them with the practical skills, coaching them along the way, helping them get access to capital, helping them market their products, and then helping them continue on as they move through their business. And so a program like ours does exist. There are lots of organizations working to help farmers get into the business of farming and to succeed in the business of farming and hopefully stay in the business of farming. And so Jorge came through a lot of these programs. He started on an incubator farm. He bought a piece of property in Leominster and is starting to clear the land and continuing his business. So there are plenty of examples and stories like Jorge's that I could tell, but I just wanted to point out that there are a lot of people that are really strongly trying to support farmers in their quest to farm. And I think things that are really successful about keys to success for successful farmers is they have to have this business and marketing savvy. They need to have an entrepreneurial spirit, a systems approach to doing this. This is a complex operation, a strong vision, technical skills, and then resilience and adaptability as they move forward with their dreams. I'm sorry the font kind of went all over the place here. But supporting their producers in the journey, it takes a village to help farmers succeed. And so I think, again, as I mentioned before, having the right policies in place at the local level, having different groups that are supporting this at all levels is important. Making sure land access and lease support or ownership support is accessible, affordable, housing needs to be available, and then all these other ongoing supports and education of consumers that value local food. So this is sort of some of our results over the past couple decades of work, really helping people get out there on the land and grow food and start their businesses. And our goals as we move forward or to continue in our next 5-year plan is to get another 1,500 farmers on the land. Now that's not gonna come close to making a dent in that 10,000 farmers that we need in New England, but we're doing the best that we can and look forward to partnering with all of you. So I think some of the things that you all can do, if you're just a consumer or an interested vested party or someone with some power and leverage here, we can all look at our eating choices and support our local farmers in our community as a first step. We can all grow our own food as well to add some resiliency. We can advocate, be more engaged and active citizens, so when policy issues come up or interesting conversations like these happen, being part of that and advocating for change. And then helping to make sure we keep farmland as a clear priority in our sustainability plans and development plans, and make sure that when we think about housing and affordability and all of that, that farmer housing is a piece of that in our communities, and volunteering. I also have to put in a shameless self-promotion. We're doing this Ag Plate project. It's also a way to continue to raise consumer education and awareness about the importance of keeping farmland and buying local food and things like that. So I do have some postcards in the back. And then finally, I just want to end with a quick story about Mustache and this little baby calf that I think sometimes we think about, oh, it's just one farm, it's just a few acres, is it really gonna matter if we save this land? Is it really gonna add to long-term food security? And I think we need to think about farms as more than just a place to go buy some carrots or some vegetables. It's also a place where we can really build community and rebuild the community connections between ourselves that I think we're really, as we can see from society and my own personal view, I feel like we're missing, and that some of that's eroding. And so looking at farms as an opportunity to really bring back that social fabric and that community connectedness that our connection to the land brings. And so this story is one that happened in Lincoln on the farm where I live at Codman Community Farm. We raise beef cattle and a bunch of other livestock. And this spring, early on, one of our cows gave birth. And so my husband went out and he tagged the baby calf. It's all well and exciting. Yay, successful birth. All that good stuff. The next day, went out to check on them and saw the calf, and its ear tag had disappeared. So he was like, well, what happened there? So he went to get another ear tag and tagged it, and then all of a sudden, the baby calf that had an ear tag ran out from the other end of the field, was nursing the mom. He's like, oh, there must have been twins. And that's really not that common. Only 1 out of every 200 births are twins, and it's like less than 0.5%. So it wasn't something we were expecting. But unfortunately, the mother cow rejected its baby calf. So we moved him in the barn, and we got all 3 of them together. We thought maybe she'll take to nursing him, and nope, she was having none of it. So the calf was getting weaker. And then, it's a busy time of the year. It was early May. There's a lot going on the farm. My husband and one other guy running, 180 acres of land and lots of livestock stuff. We're not going to bottle feed this calf 3 times a day for the next, 5 months. So we really called in a lot of volunteers from the community and kids and everyone, and over the next 3 months plus, we had a whole troop of people that came to the farm multiple times a day to bottle feed this cow, and eventually they named him Mustache, which is the story. But I just wanted to share that with you because, Mustache ended up going to the school during, a community event, and people knew him. Kids walked up and was like, "That's the cow I kept alive." Everybody, it was in the paper, the whole community rallied around this baby calf and kept him alive all summer. And now he's out in the field growing strong and all that good stuff. But people drive around now and they look at the cows differently. They look at how the land is managed differently. And so these things matter, even if it's just a small parcel of land. Having that connection and having those opportunities to connect people to their food and the land and each other, I think is why we really need to pay attention to this issue. So just some other pictures of preserving community, and I thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Presentation, it's okay if we link.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's right, sorry. Okay. I guess we're going to do Q&A.
Yeah, I think we have time for just a few questions before we move on to the next speaker, so if anybody has questions.
Yes. Hi.
Yes, we will, yes.
Yes, great.
Yeah, the question was, will the presentations be made available to the participants? And yes, we will do that.
Cool. Great. Yes.
I'm curious, is there a specific model for affordable agricultural housing?
Sure. The question was, is there a model for affordable agricultural housing? And I think there are lots of examples. We actually have someone in the room here from Concord, Mass., and I was part of that when I lived there and was on the Ag Committee. And the town actually was able to raise funds through a variety of sources and put money in and bought housing on a piece of already conserved property and put out a request for proposals for a farmer to both live in the housing and use the land. And so that's been a model of town-owned housing that goes with conservation land and other property for leasing out affordably to farmers. I think it's mostly municipal where that happens, but also there are other, affordable housing. I think some communities have tried to use, 40B designation for all different types of affordable housing, and including farmers in that category as well, although it's not always on actual farmland, so that can be a little bit tricky for the farmer. And I don't know if other people in the audience have other examples that they can think of. Yeah.
So one more question.
Sure. Yes.
You mentioned agritourism, which I'm assuming agri-tainment probably falls into that category as a way to help sustain farms, and I think that in Kingsborough we have some of that, but are there any cautionary tales that we might want to look out for before we go above and beyond to help support that portion of their business?
Yeah, so the question was around agritainment and agritourism, and are there any cautionary tales about that? I think that's a great question. I know that Farm Bureau has taken up some of that as an issue. Where does it cross the line from being an agricultural production operation and being an entertainment function? And I think that's something that needs to be paid attention to carefully. I mean, I think it's hard to fault a farmer for wanting to make their business economically viable, but you can also swing too far in the other direction where it becomes just another venue and not necessarily the revenue isn't derived from actually growing food. And if they're benefiting from tax breaks and other incentives to keep their land in agricultural production, I think that's something that people need to decide what is reasonable in that respect. So I don't have the perfect answer, but I think we do need to be careful about that.
Okay. So I'm eager with one last follow-up question.
Sure.
Really quick question. How much agricultural land in Massachusetts has been lost to big solar farms? I'm not talking about solar installation to allow the farm to supplement their energy needs. I'm talking about loss of prime soil or prime forest land to.
Do you know that?
I can take that one. So the question is, if we know how much prime agricultural land has been lost to the large ground-mounted solar arrays. And I don't have that number, but I am in touch with a professor at Clark University who right now is doing a GIS analysis of solar arrays across the state and how much forest land and farmland has been converted to those. And I believe his students are going to be presenting a poster at the MACC conference the first Saturday in March. So hopefully we will have some more data on that soon. We do know that several thousands of acres at least of forest and farmland combined have been converted to solar arrays in the last, say, 10 years, but I don't have a precise number yet. So I think, yeah.
Thought of one other thing. Sorry, I just recalled a good model, I think, for your housing question. The Vermont Community Land Trust has a really great models of how they make farm housing affordable with their land process. So there's caps on the value and square footage and development. So if a farm is, if someone is buying a property and there's a set aside to either build or expand or renovate housing, there are certain caps in terms of how much it can accelerate in value and things like that, so that it can stay affordable for the next farmer that comes along. So that might be a good place to look for that information.
And just one other comment I would add on the solar is that the state, under the latest solar incentive program, they do have a category for dual use agriculture and solar, where they have some standards about how high the equipment has to be, and that it has to be no more than 50% shading. And they believe that we're going to be able to continue to grow crops underneath those types of arrays. We have to see how that all works out, but they are experimenting with that as well. And I think now I'm going to hand this over to Kathy Sfera from Stowe to talk about land conservation planning and projects and give us some examples.
Can you help me hand out the notes?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. So I have two handouts. One of them follows along with the presentation, so you can take notes on it. And that's what Heidi is handing out. There's a second handout, which is about our town's Chapter 61 process, that's on the back table. You don't need that now, but you can grab it on the way out if you want. And there are not as many copies of that one, so if you're here with a group, if you could just take one, that would be great. So I'm Kathy Sfera. I'm the conservation coordinator from Stowe, and there's sort of a joke in planning school that if you're not at least 30 miles from home, you're not an expert. And if that's true, I'm in deep trouble, because Stowe is immediately to the south of Acton. And what I wanted to talk about today, what I was asked to talk about, is some of the things that we've done in Stowe that have kind of set the table, if you will, for maximizing our conservation success. You all know your communities way better than I do, and you know what will work and what won't work in your towns, but my hope is that you can come away with some ideas of things that you might try, and that you might also be inspired to take on a new or bigger challenge in your community. It has been an extraordinary past year in Stowe. We completed 6 conservation projects, a total of 235 acres, a lot of sweat, a lot of sleepless nights, standing on the edge of the precipice, not knowing if we were going to jump or not. And among those projects, I think, and I'll be highlighting a couple of them at the end, we protected 3 farms in the last year in Stowe, one of them in partnership with the state's APR program, and 2 of them in partnership with the Stowe Conservation Trust through conservation restrictions. Those conservation restrictions really encourage those properties to stay in agriculture. And I think also listening to the last presentation, both of them have enabled essentially the intergenerational transfer of farms where we had older retiring farmers now passing on the land to be farmed by the next either family member or in one case a new farmer. We also, at the same time, protected a very important piece of land in Stowe as a joint conservation and affordable housing project. And I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But that's kind of a graphic that shows you all the properties. As I step back from all of that, to me, really some of the keys to our success are having a plan, having some processes that make conservation relatively easy, availability of funding, a deliberate approach to landowner cultivation, and maintaining community support and credibility. This is the first open space plan for Stowe that was done 50 years ago. back in the days that planners used magic markers and typewriters. And at the time, the town only had about 3,000 people. It was more or less a blank slate. And they actually hired a consultant back then to do this plan. And it's interesting to me to see, if you look at our map of open space today, how much, you can see that some of the things that were planned back in 1965 have come to fruition today. The point being that your plan is really your blueprint. And if you don't know what it is that you want to protect, you're more likely to be diverted by sort of the opportunities of the moment, rather than having the courage to say, no, not that one, it's not important, because we have higher priorities. This is our open space plan today. GIS makes the coloring a lot easier than having to use magic markers. And what we have in our open space plan is a whole series of maps that identify parcels that are important to different attributes, be they water resources, scenic resources, agricultural resources, and they're all separate maps. We made a very deliberate decision that it being a small town, we were not going to identify specific parcels that we wanted to protect in the plan. So we don't say, the Smith property is our highest priority, but it would show each of the parcels and why they're important. And then out of that kind of came, and this is the EOA's requirement, an action map that shows what it is that the town is trying to do in a very general way. And then there's the secret map that takes all of those layers in a very McHargian fashion, if you know that. And the darker the blue, the more important the property is in terms of the different attributes that are identified in the plan. One of the properties that we're talking about today, Carver Hill, is actually this one. So you can see that that really was truly our highest priority. You can do an open space plan that conforms to EOEA's requirements. It's a lot of work. They do have grants available for planning for small communities. You can do a plan that meets your requirements. You can use magic markers. It doesn't matter, but I think the important thing is to have a plan. Within our town-wide open space plan, we also have some kind of sub-area plans. So one of the things that's a priority in the town is creating this kind of Emerald Necklace Trail network. So we've identified, where the gaps are and the pieces that are important to fill that in. We're also embarking on some detailed planning for some of our golf courses and trying to understand which portions of those properties are most important to protect. I also have, also unpublished, my secret top 10 list, which are those parcels that are important to the town, to the Conservation Commission, that I will go to the mat to find a way to protect if those opportunities become available. And so it's more in my head, although it is on paper, thinking about what those properties are that are really critical for us, in most cases for linkage and trail connections and expansion of some of our existing conservation areas. The town of Stowe is fortunate to still have a tremendous amount of land in Chapter 61, 61A, 61B, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the processes that we have in place that give us an opportunity to consider some of these properties. We still have, at last count, about 112 parcels in Chapter, totaling a little over 2,000 acres. And we've had some, shall I say, unfortunate experiences with hasty decisions about some of these properties, when citizens, board members were in a room ready to say, this property is important, we'd like an opportunity to conserve it, and a previous Board of Selectmen said, nope, we're not taking discussion, we're done, we're passing on our right of first refusal. So what came out of that back in 2008, and this is the document in the back of the room, is a Chapter 61 review process that was adopted by the Board of Selectmen, and whose purpose is to really make sure that the town gives thorough consideration to any properties that are coming out of Chapter, be they important for conservation and open space, affordable housing, recreation, or a municipal fire station if we needed it. And so I'm going to not go in too much detail But essentially what happens is, as soon as that notice comes to the town, the selectman's office confirms that the notice is properly received, that it's in the proper form, figures out what the last day of the 120-day period is that the town has for its right of first refusal, and then gives notice broadly to all of the town boards and committees that might be interested in the property, and also to the local land trust, which is interesting. And then what happens at that point is there's a group convened that's the Chapter 61 Quick Response Team. It's mostly staff, but there are some chairmen of various boards that are involved. And the purpose of that group is really to gather as much information as is known about the property at present, what its attributes are, what you can figure out without going out there, based on existing plans and studies and information, and compiling all of that information for the Board of Selectmen. They then advertise and hold a joint boards meeting to which all boards and committees are invited and have an opportunity to comment on the desirability of acquiring the property. If at that point, as sometimes happens, everybody says, yeah, not so much, the selectmen will pass on their right of first refusal. So that can be fairly quick. But if there is interest in the property, the selectmen would then essentially appoint a working group to really go into a little bit more detail, figure out, how the property might be used, what it's important for, what kind of funding plan might be put together to acquire the property, and then they would continue in that process of having a public hearing and sorting out what the future use of the property might be. There have been situations where there are properties that are considered important by various groups for more than one use, and so the assumption is that that process will kind of sort out whether there's an opportunity for a shared use, whether there are really competing uses for the property, and then the selectmen would make a decision at some point. So this happens for every property that's coming out of chapter, and really gives us an opportunity to give some thought to it. We also have, and I'm sure that many of you have in your communities, a lot of good collaborative relationships with town boards and committees around open space. Our assessors will let us know if somebody's inquiring about a property that's in chapter and wanting them to calculate the rollback taxes, or if they see a property coming on the market. We're working literally daily with our planning department on proposed subdivisions, open space set-asides, helping them with conditions to try to make sure that there's a good outcome in all of these cases. We also have, good working relationships with our local land trusts, with state and federal agencies that own land in town. We try to make sure that we know what their priorities are, and vice versa. And one of the things that we've created, which is modeled on a group called the Martha's Vineyard Conservation Partnership, is a group of people that get together periodically on the order of once or twice a year around my dining room table. Kind of one representative from each of the groups that's got an interest in open space and land conservation in town, and we talk openly about the projects that we're working on, who's leading, who might support, what's queuing up for town meeting, and it's understood that those conversations are confidential. And that is super helpful, and we're overdue for a meeting. In terms of funding, I think it's really critical both to have a source of funding to get projects started and to have a source of funding to get projects completed. Almost always, as you begin negotiating with a landowner, there's a need for some money for appraisal, for land planning, just stuff that you need to kick things off. And so we have several potential sources of funds as we look at our various projects. We have a conservation fund that's managed by the commission. We make an annual appropriation to that fund at town meeting. That is money that we can use to acquire small parcels of land. We can use it for appraisals. We also use it for a lot of our land stewardship activities. We can also accept gifts to the conservation fund, and we have received some. We are fortunate to have the Community Preservation Act in Stowe, and I think it's fair to say that many of the projects that we did in the last year wouldn't have happened without that funding source. And we have tapped our CPA administrative funds to do appraisals and to get projects started, and then have also brought a number of articles to town meeting. The Conservation Commission also has $50,000 in CPA funds that were appropriated by town meeting explicitly to provide funding for small projects and for due diligence. So that is money that we will sometimes bring to the table to get a project started. The only requirement is that we go back to the Community Preservation Committee and get their assent to use that money. You all know that there are state land grant funds. You have to have an EOEA-approved open space plan to tap those. And as I mentioned, there are also some grants for planning. Nonprofit partners can bring money to the table through fundraising. They may have their own funds in hand, and they can also apply for state conservation partnership grants, which is not on the slide. Just quickly, the opportunity to work with nonprofits, I think, is one that can really leverage municipal efforts. They can often act more quickly. Landowners may prefer to work with them for reasons of confidentiality. They have an easier time negotiating with the landowner when they're in the subdivision or other permit processes than the Conservation Commission does. I mean, I'm always sensitive to the fact that sometimes it feels like with one hand you're saying, want a permit? And the other hand, you know, you're talking about acquiring a parcel of land. It's a lot easier for a land trust to be involved at that point. Again, I think it's important to kind of understand each other's priorities and how you can best work together. And along that line, I think there are a variety of ways that land trusts and municipalities can work together, from kind of one end of the spectrum, which is the casual date, where you're just sharing information about prospective projects and opportunities, to, you know, actually a serious relationship that you're cooperating with each other. Maybe the land trust is negotiating the deal for the town. Maybe they're providing funding assistance. Maybe you two are co-sponsoring landowner workshops together, all the way through to kind of getting in bed with each other and doing the deal together. And that is the way we've done a couple of our recent projects, and it's been very satisfying, with the land trust actually either acquiring the property or an option until the town can act, or literally, you know, doing the deal together, negotiating it together, paying for it together, and each holding an interest. There is a lot of information in the handout about cultivating landowners, and I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail today, just for reasons of time. But I think it is important when you have those properties that are high on your list to be reaching out to those property owners, to get in touch with them, to let them know that the town is interested or the land trust is interested in the property. You know, let them know that they have options in terms of conservation, and really be on their mind when they're ready to do something, which may not be right away. So you may be planting seeds that will germinate a long time down in the future. But they're getting postcards and letters every day from developers and realtors who are interested in doing other things with their land. And I think it's important that they hear from conservation interests as well. I'm going to just talk very briefly about the two of the projects that we've done in the last year that were really some of the more incredible projects that we completed. The first is the Carver Hill Conservation Restriction Project. This is the property that was our highest priority in the open space plan. It is a beautiful farm, a very sort of old-timey apple picking experience, no agritourism. It's just you go and pick your apples. And this property really kind of hit all the bells on the chart in terms of its importance: water resources, scenic resources, agricultural. It sits adjacent to one of our largest conservation properties, which was celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So it was really nice timing. That all of that land had once been under the same ownership, so we kind of billed this as reuniting them in conservation. And it is also, just outside of our town center. So it offered an opportunity to provide a new access to the town forest through this property. One of the things that we did pretty successfully is to show the town what the alternative would have been had they not agreed to protect the farm. And we actually, in order to have the land appraised, had to do some land planning work that resulted in this lovely subdivision that people could get a great visual on. This is kind of how the deal, finances of the deal worked out. So the conservation restriction on 77 acres was worth about $2.5 million. We ended up leaving the landowner with a single lot in the end of the day, in part because I think it was thought that there might be a need for some farm housing, in part because, to be perfectly honest, we couldn't get to their price, and that was where we compromised. We said, what if we left you a lot? We went to the town and asked the town to appropriate $1.4 million in community preservation funds, which was the single largest CPA appropriation that had ever been made in town. It's a big ask. And then Stowe Conservation Trust fundraising and grants came to another $600,000, the landowner donating the value of the remaining $565,000. They really wanted this project to happen. As I mentioned, we left the landowner a single building lot. One of the things that we got as part of the conservation restriction was a public access trail and public parking to access the town forest adjacent. And we also made provisions for future water supply. Water supply is one of the big issues in Stowe. We knew that if we didn't do that, we were going to have some people that were not in favor of doing this. Basically, a couple of selectmen who have kind of beaten the water drum every time we've brought an acquisition in. I don't think it will ever happen, but it's a big enough property and it's close enough to the center that we wanted to include that. And so a couple of lessons that I think we learned in this process. One is the importance of persistence and flexibility. It took a long time to get these landowners to agreement. And then a key piece of our funding strategy was getting an EOEA land grant. And we put a lot of work into the application, we submitted it, and we learned that we missed getting funded by 1 point. We were the next project that would have been funded. We had an emergency meeting at my house that night. I looked at each other and said, that was $400,000, what are we gonna do? And we agreed that failure was not an option. And so Stowe Conservation Trust, God love them, said, and one of them's here today, all right, we'll try to raise that $400,000. And we really dug in and worked together, the trust and the town, to make that happen. In the end, we stayed positioned with the state. They had some, as they call it, slippage in their grants. And they called us in April and said, can you be ready to close? How much money do you still need? We still want to do this project. And we got a grant. So sometimes the stars align. One of the things that we did is this story of the protection of this property was really not just about the land. It was about the people that owned the farm. It was about farming. They were really in a situation where they needed to pass on the farm to the next generation of farmers, and the owners needed to get some money out to make that happen. If we hadn't done this project, I'm not sure this property would be in farming today. And their son, who had never farmed before, stepped up and decided that this was something he wanted to do, and is being mentored by his father. These were well-known people in the community. We wanted their voice to be heard as part of this project, and they didn't want to talk. They were very private, as many families are. And so one of the things that Stowe Conservation Trust did, and it was incredibly successful, is they made a video. They got a guy who was a drone photographer. He took a lot of the images that are in the slideshow. He interviewed all of the family members in their home, talking about this property and why it was important to them, and we showed that video at town meeting, and it was powerful. And we also showed it at every opportunity we could before town meeting. So That was a way that we got their voices at the table without them having to stand up at town meeting and ask for money, which they weren't comfortable doing. We did a ton of outreach. I mentioned the video. We had neighborhood meetings. There was an article in the Boston Globe. I don't think there was anybody in town who didn't know about this project. And we needed to do that because this farm is not very visible in the community. It's not one of those iconic landscapes that everybody drives by and knows. So, it was a way that people could learn about the property if they hadn't been there. And as I mentioned, it was our biggest CPA expenditure, and there was nearly a unanimous vote at town meeting, which was really satisfying at the end. So this project is now done. The other project I wanted to mention quickly is a project that was a partnership, again, of the town, Stowe Conservation Trust, and this time the Stowe Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. And you can see the property in pink on this map. You can sort of immediately see why it's important for reasons of linkage. All of the brown lines on the map are actually trails, so it plays kind of a key role in the regional trail network there. And I'm not going to go through this, but this property had a very long history and a very ugly history that spanned about 15 years, court battles, the landowner getting left without any money, even though the town had tried to buy it once before. And she had listed the property in September of 2014 for $1.5 million. Over the course of years and months, that price dropped and dropped and dropped till it was on the market for $500,000. And we said, that's what it's worth. And we went and made her an offer. The timing could not have been worse. This was in the middle of the Carver Hill campaign. This was when we found out that we hadn't gotten the state grant. We didn't have a choice but to move forward and try to protect the property. So everybody rolled up their sleeves and said, all right, let's do it. And this is what we did. We essentially acquired the vast majority of the property, much of which is wet, for conservation for $225,000. Again, water supply is part of the picture. The remainder of the property, the land shown in red, was acquired by the Stowe Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, again for $225,000, for the construction of 4 to 6 affordable housing units. We went to them and said, we have an opportunity to secure this property. We'd like to work with you. Here's the deal. You only get to build 4 to 6 units because we think that's what works on this property, what maintains the conservation values, and what the neighbors will accept. And they agreed. And that was all written into the town meeting vote and into an MOU that we had with them. The property has a number of derelict buildings, and so we were actually able to show town meeting what we were thinking about in terms of kind of a concept plan for what would happen there. And there were a couple different plans, but basically, 4 to 6 units, duplexes, pretty much sitting on the footprint of the existing farm buildings. So this project, again, we split the purchase price between the two entities. The really valuable piece is that Stowe Conservation Trust stepped in with this landowner who was predisposed to not like the town very much, and they plunked down an option payment of 10% to secure the property until we had an opportunity to go to town meeting and buy it. So SCT put that money at risk and trusted that the town would perform. A couple of lessons learned here, and then I'll wrap up. This was a property that was in chapter. We knew that sooner or later we would have an opportunity to try to match a purchase price when the landowner could find a buyer. But we didn't want to wait for that. We didn't want to be in a position where we had to match terms that might be unfavorable, where we were under a 120-day clock. So we decided to reach out to her proactively and try to negotiate a deal. I mentioned the timing was terrible. Again, we kind of did this deal completely hand in hand with Stowe Conservation Trust, and their ability to secure the option to hold the property till town meeting could vote was really critical. It was a great opportunity to meet multiple municipal needs on one site. So we essentially brought more people under the tent in terms of getting support for this acquisition. And one of the things that we did that I think was really successful is that the neighbors to this property had had a long history of involvement with it. And we reached out to them before we even made public the fact that we were going to do this deal, and talked to them about what our vision for the property was. We talked to them about the idea of having 4 to 6 units on it. And to my utter amazement, we had 100% support from the abutters to this property, not just the direct abutters, but the immediate neighbors. And so they actually went to town meeting with us, asking the town to appropriate the money to make this project happen and kind of bring this long story to a close in a way that worked for everybody. So this was, I think, a great example of kind of staying positioned through a lot of changing circumstances to bring this one to fruition. So in closing, I guess I would say, don't let the actions of others determine your priorities. Know what you want to conserve and really keep your focus. Be realistic, but also be creative enough to find partners that you might not normally work with to make a project happen. Bring in experts as you need them, and persevere. Stay positioned for changing circumstances. And lastly, don't forget to celebrate when it's done.
Thanks, Kathy. That was great, and it tied in on the farming and the housing as well as the conservation, so that really kind of brought everything together. We can take a few questions for Kathy, and then we'll move on to the panel after that.
Okay. Rita.
First of all, congratulations. Those were two amazing case studies and really big successes. I have a technical question about funding your conservation fund, the conservation fund. Do they get two sources of funding, one from CPA and one from town meeting floor?
So the question was whether our conservation fund gets two sources of funding from CPA and from town meeting floor. So the conservation fund we keep separate. It receives funding on town meeting floor. So every year we go and we ask for somewhere between $0 and $10,000 just to maintain the balance of the fund, generally. That's just a municipal appropriation to the fund. The money that we've gotten from CPA was actually a voted article at town meeting to give the Conservation Commission this pool of $50,000 that we can use for land acquisition. I know that in some towns, there's money that goes straight into the Conservation Fund from CPA. I have a little bit of a concern personally about that because the uses of the Conservation Fund are broader than CPA, so I think it's just important to keep funds segregated. So how do you buy land with $20,000 or $30,000? There's that rare parcel that you might be able to find for that. But no, I mean, we keep a balance in our conservation fund usually of about $30,000 to $40,000. That's not money to buy land generally. That's going to be money to do the appraisal or to pay for the legal work, reviewing a deed or something like that. So it's enough to get a project queued up, but then we would go to town meeting with a specific request for the acquisition funds.
Usually things, I mean, how often do you have town meeting? Twice a year?
We have town meeting twice a year, yep.
It'd be a long lag, longer than a chapter 6 months before you even have town meeting.
So the question is how to deal with the 120-day clock given the twice-a-year town meeting. I'm trying to think of when the last time we acquired a Chapter 61 property in that process was, but we will schedule a special town meeting if it's an important enough project that we need to do that. Stowe has the unfortunate, I can't think of the word, experience of having an SJC case decided that we exercised our right of first refusal on the 121st day, and therefore it was not a valid exercise. Yes.
After you acquire these properties,
An excellent question. Who stewards these properties after they're acquired? So if it's acquired by the town, then the town stewards the properties. I now have a very long list of things to do: posting boundaries, management plans, trail markers, because it takes time to bring all of these properties online. In the case of the 2 farm conservation restrictions that we just completed with Stowe Conservation Trust, we actually have an MOU between the 2 entities for how we'll share our conservation stewardship responsibilities. Not quite signed, but almost done. In the back.
Yes, everybody's West Adams. When I was selected, I asked our town council whether or not we could do a land bank, like Vineyard and Nantucket. And he said basically there's nothing stopping us because the enabling language is in place. We have to do a home rule petition to do that. But have you guys thought about doing that? Is there any talk around the table of doing more land banks in Massachusetts?
I think the question was, has there been any talk of more land banks in Massachusetts, in Stowe or elsewhere? It is, I agree with your counsel, it's my understanding that you would need to seek special legislation. And I haven't kind of looked into this lately, but my recollection is that if the funding source was a real estate transfer tax, that the realtors were pretty opposed to that. So I don't know whether there are other towns that have done it.
Ipswich has one, but that was pre-CPA.
Yeah, Ipswich, I think, did a bond authorization, and they have a very active land acquisition program in Ipswich. And we have one more question. Yep.
How willing is Stowe to bridge the gap between CPA funds and the price, the cost?
So how willing is Stowe to breach the gap between CPA funds and the price? So the projects that we did in the last year, we were able to get to the whole price between CPA funds, donations from, or contributions from Stowe Conservation Trust, and landowners willing to forego a chunk of the purchase price. The other project that we did with the housing component, it was CPA funds, Stowe Conservation Trust funds, and then Stowe Municipal Affordable Housing Trust has their own money that they brought to the table. I think if we had had to ask for tax dollars, if you will, separate from CPA, I think it depends on the project. I think obviously it's a harder sell. People start talking about, how much your taxes go up to cover the project. I personally think that if you bring good projects that you can demonstrate a need for and that you show good leverage, that's the recipe for success. But every town is in its own financial situation too.
In Littleton, we just purchased a large piece, and maybe had a lot of it at CPA, but are now paying off some debt
Yeah.
through CPA.
Yeah, and in fact, Stowe is still paying off debt from other large purchases like Flag Hill that we did many years ago that had to be bonded. So, CPA has definitely changed the equation about funding a bit, but we've been fortunate that I think every land project that we've brought to town meeting in the CPA era has passed.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kathy, that was really great. So, yes, thanks. Awesome. So I would like to invite our panelists to come up now to the front, and we will do that part of the workshop. So the way this works is, since we're being recorded on cable, when you're speaking, we need to turn the microphone on. So I don't know if we either share or we can also pass this to you. Yeah, possibly, if you can come down to one of the mics. Yeah. Why don't you come over here? So while they're getting settled in, I'll introduce them, and then we have some questions that I'm going to put up on the screen that we'll start with, and then we can take other questions beyond that. So we have, just in the order that they're listed here, Marianne Iarosi, who is a senior planner in Framingham. And then Will Nazer, who's an assessor in Framingham. And Peter Berry, who has a variety of community experience, including as both the selectman and the CPA representative in town here in Acton. And then Tom Tidman, the Natural Resource Director here in Acton. So I'm going to just take a moment and put up some questions. Oops. Just want to show. There we go. Okay, so we were hoping that each of the panelists could begin by addressing the first question. What values do you see for open space in relation to your particular role within the town, and how your community addresses or struggles with the different competing demands that we've talked about today? And we can just begin here and go down.
Well, Tom Tidman, Natural Resources. We're the folks that put together the open space and recreation plan for the town of Acton. And our decision was to make it more of a desktop or a coffee table book, as opposed to some that just seem a little tired and get stuck on a shelf. This is full of photographs and ideas that we had for acquisition. We have about 1,800 acres of conservation land in Acton, and since Community Preservation Act was adopted in Acton in 2002, we've acquired about 100 acres of conservation land using CPA. By today's prices, an acre of land in Acton, a buildable acre of land in Acton, somewhere around $350,000 or up, depending on whether some other things come into play. So we're the folks that preserve whatever open space is left, and obviously it's significant to us to watch these few remaining farms that are out there do what we can to save them. Listening to Kathy speak a minute ago, we have all the exact same situations in Acton and have had some success purchasing farms.
I'm Peter Berry, a selectman in Acton. I've lived here for 30 years, and I've been on the Acton Housing Authority Board of Commissioners. That's the agency that deals with low-income rentals for families, seniors, and individuals with disabilities. I've been on the Acton Community Housing Corporation, which deals with home ownership programs for moderate-income families. I'm in my third term as a selectman, and I was the first chair of the Community Preservation Committee when Acton jumped on board very early in the program in 2002. Since the name of this forum is Open Space, Farms, and Housing, is there room for all? I thought I'd just talk briefly about how Acton has dealt with those problems. Through a combination several years ago of both community preservation funds and town funds, Acton was able to save I believe it goes back to the colonial era farm in South Acton. That came about by first that landowner cultivation that Kathy talked about, several years of very talented members of our Land Stewardship Committee and Acton Conservation Trust, meeting with the homeowner, encouraging them to continue to work with the town to ensure the farm would operate indefinitely as a farm, and we were able to structure a deal where we purchased the land and allowed the farmers to continue to live there and utilize it as a farm, and put a conservation restriction on it that ensures that it'll be a farm for as far into the future as we can hope. More recently, the town was embroiled in litigation with a developer on a piece of property right down Main Street here where Route 2 comes off, the exits come off of Route 2. Permit had been denied, the developer sued the town. We came to a resolution of the litigation by agreeing to purchase the property. Town meeting appropriated $1.8 million out of free cash to buy the land. We put together a committee to determine what the best use of it would be in town. They have just recommended that, the selectmen have supported moving forward with this year's town meeting to, first of all, build a 31-unit rental building on the property to be owned and operated by the Acton Housing Authority. We have very talented and experienced people who've worked in low-income housing development over the years on the Board of Commissioners. They will pay the town $1 million to purchase the property that they will locate their 31-unit rental for low-income seniors. That's the highest need in Acton for housing right now is low-income rental properties for seniors. So that's what we're trying to address. The town will, they will ask the Community Preservation Committee for $500,000 as a contribution from the town. It's very challenging to put together these low-income projects these days because of both the federal and state funds have dried up, but so you need to cobble together lots of different funding sources, low-income housing tax credits, other funding sources to make these projects work. But the town will receive $1 million from the Housing Authority to replenish some of that free cash they used to purchase the property. And half of the property will still be open space, currently planned to be a dog park, which a lot of people in town are interested in seeing put together. So those are two examples, one farm, one piece of property that will have affordable housing and open space on it. I'd also encourage people to look at recreation as an open space opportunity. The town has, the Community Preservation Committee since 2002 has appropriated $6.5 million for open space. As Tom mentioned, about 100 acres of conservation land. About $3.5 million to support community housing programs, and about $5.25 million for recreation. We have a 40 acres in North Acton, the North Acton recreation area, originally financed by digging out the gravel that was on the property and selling it, which allowed us to purchase the property and build a beautiful park on 40 acres. We have a swimming hole, we have fishing facilities there. The Community Preservation Committee has continued to support that by building other amenities, a picnic facility, a stage where we have performances and fireworks on 4th of July. It's a great open space in town. It's part of Tom's responsibilities to maintain it as Natural Resources Director. So recreation is also a way to attain open space in town as well as simply conservation area. We've done other things in town. The Community Housing Corporation supports the low-income, again, moderate income purchases, home ownership programs through the 40B program. They work with developers to align the proposals with the town's guidelines. We have a housing production plan approved by the state that promotes different ways to build affordable housing. We converted the old school in town. The school district sold the town cleared the land, the old high school, which was empty, on to create 21 units of family housing. So those are some of the initiatives that Acton's taken to try to deal with these conflicts between open space and farming and affordable housing.
Thanks, Peter. Those are some really great examples. So, Mary Ann. What's Framingham doing?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name's Mary Ann Iarossi. I'm with the City of Framingham's Division of Community and Economic Development, and I work as a planner, but the department that I work in is economic development heavy, so it makes for an interesting role. I work very closely with a lot of our other departments, including our Conservation Commission, and our Economic Development Department just tends to be very business-friendly, if you will. We manage the zoning board and the historic preservation processes also, so it ends up being really great to work in that office because we get to see all of the business developments that are coming in, and we get to have a voice at the table in terms of how to maybe improve them or strike that balance between open space and housing and business development. And I don't think anybody has the answer for what's the correct balance, you know, what percentage of open space should we have versus housing versus businesses, because our communities are also very different. But it's always an interesting role and issue to tackle. A couple of things that we're doing to address the competing demands. So we have, I like to call an aggressive open space strategy. After hearing Kathy speak, though, I'm kind of thinking we have to do a little bit more. But one of the struggles that we have is that we don't have CPA. We're not a CPA community, which is a huge hit on us. We also don't have a conservation fund. We have an open space special purpose account that was funded probably 2 or 3 years ago at one of our last town meetings before we became a city. We asked for an appropriation for $75,000 to basically provide seed funding for the special purpose account. Our plan was to go back to town meeting every year and ask for a little bit more so that we could increase it, but then we turned into a city and it kind of got placed on the back burner. There's a lot of other priorities that the city's handling right now, so we haven't quite approached this subject of increasing the open space funding that we have internally. So right now we use that funding for due diligence activities if we want to research property, do an appraisal, do some environmental work, things like that, just to get some projects off the ground. We have a prioritization list that we always had as part of our open space and rec plan, but recently in the past 5 years or so, the city has hired new staff that work really well together. Looking at Rob, our conservation administrator, because he's in the room. Our planning department, our conservation department, our planning board, along with our DPW and Parks and Rec divisions all work really well together. So we created a more robust open space prioritization list, which includes a variety of criteria. We started out with a few properties, and it's grown over the years because we are quite ambitious. There's over 100 properties on the list right now. Anything that pops up that is on the market that could potentially offer some environmental benefits to the community, we'll obviously bump those in priority. But we look at things such as its natural resource habitats, if it's wetlands or biomap habitat, and if there's flood storage capacity, if it's in an area that's currently not very saturated with open lands, open space lands. We also, on the flip side, look at areas that, properties that abut existing conservation lands so that we could create more of a robust, contiguous open space area. Struggles, as I mentioned, we don't have CPA. There's a lot of competing interests. We're an very urban community, so there's a lot of development coming in, trying to balance that. Basically, we have probably only I would say under 5 or so large-scale properties that need protection. A lot of the properties we have are also fairly small that we want to look at just for simple things such as flood storage capacity in a neighborhood that's notorious for flooding. Our downtown and our south side neighborhoods are environmental justice, low-income neighborhoods, and they don't have a lot of open space opportunities. Our new mayor, Mayor Spicer, wants to make it a priority to focus on those areas. So we're trying to be more creative in terms of how we can bring more open space and park opportunities to those low-income urban areas, which tends to be pretty difficult. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say for now.
Mary Ann, before you pass the microphone there, do you just want to mention, you also have updated your ordinances in recent years and revised your open space
Oh, Heidi.
zoning and transfer development rights. Has any of that paid off?
Yes, so I am not the zoning expert per se. Our zoning expert's not here today, but I knew you were going to ask that, so I kind of did a little bit more research. We do have some fairly new zoning bylaws, ordinances. We're actually in the process of changing them to ordinances, but we have an open space cluster subdivision bylaw, and we have an agricultural preservation bylaw, and then we have transfer of development right bylaw. TDR being the most new, and I don't think we've issued any special permits under that transfer of development rights bylaw at the moment. It's only like a year or two old, and we're trying to figure it out just as much as developers and property owners are figuring it out. But the open space cluster development bylaw is probably the most popular. We actually have 2 pending projects right now that are in the permitting phase, and what that does is it takes a large property that's undeveloped, an open space land, and we work with the developer so that they cluster the housing. And basically, they'll cover 40% roughly of that property, and then 60%, the remaining 60% has to be held into a conservation restriction, either held by the city or a nonprofit land trust. We work a lot with Sudbury Valley trustees on projects such as that. So the open space cluster development bylaw tends to be pretty popular.
Thanks, Mary Ann. So,
It's not gonna
Not going to move, okay, that's fine. Good afternoon, my name is Will Naser. I'm the Chief Assessor for the City of Framingham. I've been in Framingham as the Chief Assessor for 6 years and spent 14 years in municipal assessment, including down the road in Boxborough. In reference to the first question, our role in assessing property is to value the property. We're really the town or the city appraisers. That's the role of the assessor. We do have discretion and jurisdiction on chapter land qualification, use and disqualification. It's really only, it's one of the areas we have jurisdiction on. We really don't have a lot of jurisdiction, as much as people like to come to us for zoning and other building questions. It's really not it's not what we do. I think to promote a balance of construction growth with open space, to repurpose properties, I think that's desirable, and not take away from open space if possible. But really, we don't give a direct opinion or input on projects or to developers or other departments. It's usually, we tend to go to the technical meetings and review what's going to happen, but it's not something where we formalize input on the projects. And again, we're at the tail end of the development loop. Put it up, we'll put a value on it, we'll put a tax assessment on it for sure, and then we look at the project when it's complete and finalize the value. So those are kind of from an assessing standpoint. That's how we look. That's how I'm looking at the demands and how to situate ourselves. But I tend to stay somewhat neutral on this in these areas because, again, we're there to do our role as valuing the property for tax purposes.
thanks, Will. So we don't necessarily need to go down the line on the other 2 questions, but I'll throw the next one out there, and then whoever wants to take it can take it, and if somebody else wants to add, they can. So, for some people, land is just a commodity. Other people, it represents a way of life, an ecological asset. It certainly is a finite resource, and, impacts on one property affect others in the surrounding community. So how do we balance the private ownership interests with the community aspect of private land use. Does anybody have any particular thoughts on that?
I pondered this question for a while, because it's a difficult one, but I might be a little strong in terms of being an environmentalist. I mean, if you're not protecting land and you don't have land, then there probably isn't going to be a society. You know, it's difficult when someone owns something and you're basically saying, well, no, you have to give that for the community as a whole, for the better well-being of the community and the quality of life. That's difficult. So I don't think there's a good answer, but my best answer that I could come up with is conservation easements and restrictions end up being a really great middle ground, because you're protecting the property in perpetuity, but also you're allowing the private homeowner or property owner to use the land as they see fit. And that's a conversation that the city or the town is having with the property owner. It's not just the city is doing this and the property owner has to agree to it. It's a conversation across the table. Basically, what does the property owner want to do with the property? How can we work this into a conservation restriction? And then you can write in the fact that the land can be used by the public, even though it's held privately and the private homeowner still lives on it and uses it. I mean, I think that's just one of the better answers in our world. How do you balance the private ownership with the community's impact and quality of life overall?
I would just add to that, that it takes a lot of work. I mean, as Kathy had said earlier, you have to build relationships with all of these landowners. Many of the large landowners in Acton are wonderful land stewards. They love their property. They would love to do anything they could to keep it as protected open space, but obviously taxes, and then as they get older and they have to look into the future, they have to make big decisions. We're very fortunate to work really closely with our Acton Conservation Trust. And it's often the starting point for developing relationships with homeowners, landowners. Landowners are not always that excited to deal with the town itself. And the Conservation Trust really starts that bridge or develops that relationship. We've had an open space committee since 2006. They meet monthly. There's a member of the Board of Selectmen sits in with us in all of our meetings. And we really work hard, as all the communities do, to develop these relationships, and it does take a lot of time.
I would just say Acton is obviously much different than Framingham. We are not built out. We have a lot of privately owned property that still is subject to development. In terms of the planning process, we have a clustered development bylaw, which allows developers to build houses that are clustered together with a lot of open space set aside on the remainder of the property. I'm not sure we put conservation restrictions on the open space, but the developers are interested in using that concept because it saves them a lot of money. The roads are shorter, so they don't have to put in as much infrastructure to build those properties. I would also say that we have about $2.5 million now put aside in the community preservation set aside for open space. We have bonded one large 14-acre purchase of prime conservation land in town, but it takes a lot of money to acquire open space. And Acton's, the assessor will be familiar with this, probably different, a lot different in Framingham again, but Acton's tax base is about 85% residential and 15% commercial. So to the extent that the town can increase its commercial tax base without gobbling up a lot of open space, that would certainly benefit all the residents of the town and maybe provide more money to purchase more open space. We have been successful in attracting two very large companies to buildings that were already built but were vacant through the tax incentive financing state program, where you forgive some of the taxes for a number of years, and eventually the full tax rate comes back on a tax roll. So that's one strategy we've been trying to do to build up our commercial tax base.
So, and I think this last question, we've already touched on it, but I'll just give the panelists an opportunity if they want to add anything else on this or on some other burning point that has come to mind, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. So at the end of the day, how much agency does the municipality really have, versus kind of control that's out there in the private landowners, developers, or other interests? How do we maximize, how can the municipality maximize its effectiveness in cooperation with other partners? And we've heard some of that, a lot of it's building relationships with the landowners, building the systems in place to make things happen. Are there any other thoughts that you have that we haven't touched on yet?
I would just add to what Kathy had said earlier. Once we acquire conservation land, it's really important to decide if we're going to make it, accessible to the public in terms of trail systems. We have a very, very active land stewardship committee in Acton. They meet monthly, set up work days. There's a land steward assigned to each of our larger parcels so that we can really keep track of trail quality, improvements that need to be made, bridges, boardwalks, Eagle Scout projects. Because once we acquire these projects, these properties, we really need to keep the public excited about the fact that now we have these wonderful parcels and they can access them and use them. So we spend a lot of time on our management of the properties we've acquired.
Private support groups are helpful to our efforts to maintain town open space. We have an arboretum in the middle of town, again, a beautiful, beautiful facility, and there is a group called the Friends of the Arboretum that raises money, contributes sweat equity for improvements to the property, and helps fund improvements to the property. At the Community Preservation Committee, we like to see leveraged contributions to requests for funding. That includes the town funding requests. They come in with requests for funding improvements to the Arboretum. Often the Friends of the Arboretum will kick in a percentage of funding to help encourage the Community Preservation Committee to make those recommendations to town meeting.
And I guess I would just add that there can be a lot of different partners in the community, and you never know until you ask. So even like the local Home Depot or the Lowe's, asking them for donations either in cash or supplies for boardwalks, for trails, or for landscaping for a more urban park can even be helpful. We've partnered with them in the past on some small-scale projects. And we, with our local land trust, when we work with conservation restrictions, what we've been doing recently, and I don't know if other communities really do this, but we do like a double protection. So if the town or the city is acquiring the property, we'll look to a local land trust to also hold a CR or vice versa. So if a local land trust is buying a property, we'll see if the Conservation Commission can hold the CR, just in case. You never know in terms of the political nature or funding for those nonprofits in the future. If something happens where the protection is lost, at least there's another entity holding on to some protection through the conservation restriction or elsewhere. And I just want to add that I think public education is also really important, because a lot of people don't know about these resources that the cities and the towns can provide. We get calls all the time of people saying, I have this property and I don't know what to do with it, and then we can walk them through the process at that point. But I'm kind of thinking maybe we need to do more consistent workshops, just inviting certain neighborhood groups and whatnot in to talk to them about land protection and stewardship, future estate planning, and just conservation restrictions in general. We were working with a property owner on a conservation restriction on her property for a while. Unfortunately, it didn't come to fruition, but 3/4 of the way through the process, she came to one of our presentations that was a neighborhood meeting, and afterwards, it seemed like her eyes lit up like, oh, now I get what a conservation restriction is. And we had been working with her for a number of years at that point. So sometimes we take it for granted that people automatically know what we're talking about when we say conservation restrictions and easements and land protection and biomap habitat. but a lot of people don't know what those things mean. So public education, I think, is key too, because the property owners and the public is going to be a huge partner.
Yeah, I could start talking about deriving capitalization rates and assessment to sale ratios, but this is somewhat out of what I would do in terms of fostering relationships or doing anything like that. So I'll leave that to Mary Ann and the other groups to do that in town. Excuse me,
I
city.
think Will's being a little modest too, because Will is constantly talking to the planning department and the conservation department on people that come in that might be wanting to get rid of a property that are Chapter 61 or other. So he's been an asset, and his department has been an asset in this strategy. And Chapter 61, I think moving forward, we might want to talk to Kathy about that Chapter 61 review process, because unfortunately, we don't have something as robust, and we don't know until it hits the table. I don't think we've gotten one as a city yet, but previously as a town, it would go to the selectmen, and a lot of the departments wouldn't even hear about it like quickly enough to act on it, because you only have 120 days, so, yeah.
Great, so I think we have a little bit more time, 15 minutes left. If there are questions from the audience, we can open it up there. For any of our panelists, or if you think of a question that you wanted to ask Kathy or Jen and didn't get to yet, they might be willing as well. Yes?
So I'm a bit confused because the title of this session brought up housing, included housing, and your evaluation talked about low-impact development, but we really didn't talk about that unless low-impact development is no development. So and a couple panels brought up housing, but I'm just wondering, is Mass Audubon thinking much around partnerships with housing people and working together instead of sometimes that's adversarial? Will we talk, is low-impact development, we just didn't really get brought up. I'm interested in that.
Oh, okay, so the question was about the housing component and Mass Audubon's involvement with housing issues, and also low-impact development, which is listed on the evaluation. I didn't realize that. This wasn't billed as an LID workshop. We are doing a whole series of other workshops on low-impact development this spring with Framingham, so we'll have 3 of those coming up. And if you've signed up for our e-newsletter, you can get information about that
It's
there.
at Jack's Abbey too, so you should just come for that.
Yeah. So in terms of the housing and Mass Audubon's involvement in that, I mean, we, obviously we're a conservation organization, that's what we're primarily focused on, but we also, we care about people as well as wildlife, and we recognize that there is a tremendous need for housing in this state. So we work with folks like the Smart Growth Alliance. I'm doing a workshop this spring for the Citizen Planner Training Collaborative with the Mass Housing Partnership. Really look to those other experts, but certainly promote things like limited development. Kathy had that example of the property that was divided up between conservation and doing some affordable housing, or and open space zoning can also do that. Some communities have bonuses in their open space zoning for additional units if they are affordable. And it's really all about putting, doing the conservation in the right places and doing development in the right places. And, having a 40B pop up in the middle of nowhere next to a wetland where there's no, no shopping and no transit, and I don't think that benefits the people or the environment. So the more that communities can proactively plan and find places, repurposing an old, a municipal building that's no longer being utilized, finding land that's appropriate for it. It's all about planning and about working together. I think it's one of the beauties of the CPA that it combines the affordable housing, historic preservation, open space, and recreation to all of these community interests and needs, and provides funding for all of them. So it all goes together. Yes.
Shameful, queer towns in Massachusetts. Little humor put into this incredible little get together. Being from Townsend, we are a farming community. Being a farming community, we farm. we had people buy a property across from a farm in our town, and they came into the Board of Health to complain about the smell of the morphine. This is supposed to be funny, but it's also the real world for farmers. Well, the people came in front of the Board of Health and explained their problem, and then the farmer came in front of the Board of Health and emphasized the fact that farming. And the Board of Health made the decision and determination that the farmers had the right to do it, and the realtor misrepresented the sale of the property for not expressing the fact that there was a farm across the street. Long story short, the farmer dumped a pile of manure directly across the street from his new homeowner's property. And that satisfied the situation where the people no longer complained about the farmer, and the farmer politely removed the load of manure. But there's education that has to be involved here to keep our farmers going. Once again, I'm one of those old timers, and I think that farming is a major, major asset to all communities throughout the country. And I just wanted to clear that up so that when you're discussing this in meetings, you can have a little reflection on, we have to be able to have a little smell to have good vegetables.
Great. So just for the recording, I will just summarize that this is a farmer from Townsend with a story about farming and the smells that go along with it, and people buying housing across the street from a farm, and realtors not appropriately notifying the purchasers of what their neighbors have already been doing for many, many decades. It's going to be part of their neighborhood, that, so we need education about farming and its benefits, and also, what comes along with it. I think Peter also has some.
I just wanted to mention one other strategy the town has used to successfully keep farmland. As you come through the rotary at the Concord Prison into Acton, you'll notice acres of farmland. The State Police Horse Farm is there, and there are cornfields in the summertime. That land, all that farmland is owned by the state. The prison has a farming program for prisoners, and they teach prisoners how to farm. And so we worked with our local legislative delegation and got a legislation passed that says if the state ever decides to declare that surplus land and dispose of it, the town of Acton will obtain title to that land and keep it in farmland. So using your local legislators is often also a good strategy to try to protect open space.
Yes, one more question in the back.
Yes, I have a question for the assessor. Two-part question. The first
So it was a two-part question. Well, first it was a thank you to the assessor for getting involved in open space and connecting landowners with the Conservation Commission and planning folks. And then secondly, a question about the open space being acquired around parcels that already have a good deal of open space within the actual house lot and around it, and could there be some transfer of value, perhaps through a special tax from those landowners to more dense areas that lack open space?
Yeah, well, thank you. And in terms of the special assessment, I'm not familiar with doing anything to that effect. Typically, anything that's an improved property is going to have a prime site value, and then the second is a secondary value as a residual or an excess land value. Those are the two typical land values that we put on improved properties. So trying to put something else on, or penalty, or, I'm not familiar with it, and I think we take a lot of heat enough. I don't know if I want to jump into doing something a little extraordinary in that respect, so, but I'm not familiar with anything to that effect.
Great, well, I see one more hand. I'll take one more question, and then we're going to wrap up, so, yes.
Hi, Alan Pierce. Obligation imposed on us to address that problem further.
So the question in summary is that this housing crisis is very real and very pressing, and should we be doing more than just the same old kinds of techniques that we heard about today and really stepping up the game in addressing the housing crisis?
I agree, but I think until we have new tools, we can't move forward with them. So one of the tools that I had mentioned, the transfer of development rights, I don't know if people are familiar with what that is. Yes, no? I'm seeing both. So transfer of development rights is a fairly new concept, and I don't think it's exercised too much in Massachusetts. We looked at only a few communities who have it in Massachusetts and outside of the state, but essentially what it does is it takes the development rights from a property you want to protect, such as an open space or an agricultural land, and it transfers those rights to another site that might be already developed but is already maxed out in terms of zoning capacity. So, for instance, if there's a property in our downtown or Route 9, for example, and they're already built out in terms of the size of the property and the height of the building and the unit size and count and whatnot, the square footage of the structure, they could essentially purchase the development rights from a farm that's in Framingham and build to a higher density. So basically you're controlling the development in areas where the infrastructure already exists and where the infrastructure can handle the increased capacity versus lands where it might be pristine farmland where maybe there isn't infrastructure already and you want to preserve the agricultural elements. So TDR is one of them that we've looked at, but it hasn't really taken off. We've had it for a year or two, and we still haven't received an application that's gone through the permitting process. So I'm not sure, I don't work with zoning enough to tell you why that has not happened, but that's kind of an innovative tool that we're looking at in terms of saving open space, but also trying to meet the housing crisis. Also, the state is promoting communities and developers in terms of developing areas that are already built up, such as the downtowns and business corridors and whatnot. For example, they have state infrastructure grants that they'll give to communities, but they will only fund projects that are transit-oriented development type of projects. So ones that are more near train stations and downtowns and are walkable, they won't fund projects, infrastructure projects for green space. and things like that. So the state is doing more stuff, which helps the local municipalities also address that issue, but I agree with you, there should be more creative tools. I just don't think we have quite all of the answers right now.
And I would just note that in terms of TDR, there was a provision of the big environmental bond that just passed last year and hidden in this giant bond bill. There's one provision that created a transfer development rights fund so that the state, because one of the big issues with that is somebody gets, you know, they get permission to do the higher density because they're using TDRs. How does that money get held and transferred to the purchase of the conservation land? So this would create a fund, sort of like a bank, to manage that transfer process. And the hope is that that's going to enable this mechanism to be utilized more. Okay, and it's 5 o'clock, so I'll take one more quick question. It can't be long.
In regard to the TDR, do all transfer development rights, or let's say development rights, do they depend on the current zoning of the property? How do not just homeowners, but landowners know what their development rights are? And in regard to the assessor, does the assessor have anything to do with figuring out what those development rights are?
Right, so the question is, how do you figure out what the development rights are worth, and does the assessor have a role in that?
It's similar to determining the value of a conservation restriction. So an appraisal will be brought in and they'll determine the value of the land as is with the current zoning, and then they'll determine the value of the land if you can't develop it because there's a conservation restriction on it, and that difference in the value is what the value is of the development rights or the restriction. Does that answer your question? Yeah, and we leave it up to the private market to determine the value, so the city doesn't get involved in terms of determining what the value is of the development rights. We're the permitting agency essentially, but the market value and the appraisals and whatnot is handled privately.
Great, so, Will's going to add one last comment.
No, I was just going to reiterate that we wouldn't, the assessing department wouldn't get involved with that in terms of valuing it. As Mary Ann said, it would be done privately.
Right. So I want to thank you all again for coming. Remind everybody, please fill out your evaluation forms and leave it. And in particular, if you are here for AICP continuing maintenance credits, please make sure that that was noted and that you checked in the registration in that regard. And we have some pens if anybody needs a pen. Thank you all.